At 27, Nora Wren stood in the back room of Laurel County Funeral Home with rainwater drying on the hem of her black dress and nowhere left in the world to belong. Her mother was gone. The mourners had eaten the ham biscuits, folded their napkins, and stepped into the gray Appalachian afternoon. On a side table lay the last quilt Caroline Wren had ever touched, folded into faded squares of blue, cream, and brown. Nora reached for it with both hands. Her Aunt Viola crossed the room so fast the floorboards snapped under her shoes. She snatched the quilt against her chest and looked at Nora as if she had reached for silver. "That belongs to the family," Viola said. "You don't." By sundown, Nora would be walking alone up a mountain road with one suitcase, $12 in her coat pocket, and those words burning behind her ribs. The only place waiting for her was an abandoned Appalachian quilt hall nobody had opened in years. People said the roof leaked, the beams were rotten, and the building was worth less than its weeds. But what nobody knew was that beneath its oldest loom, wrapped away from dust and rain, something had been waiting for the one woman they tried hardest to erase. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. If stories about counted-out women still mean something to you, like and subscribe, because Nora's story begins with a door closing in her face. Nora had learned early that some families could make a child feel like a guest at her own table. When she was 6, she used to sit under her mother's quilting frame while the Wren women gathered on Sunday afternoons. Their voices moved above her like crows in bare branches, sharp, knowing, never quite kind. Caroline sat at the end of the frame, quiet and straight-backed, guiding a needle through cloth with fingers reddened from laundry work. The other women wore wedding rings, church gloves, and the confidence of people whose names were written correctly on every deed and family Bible. Caroline wore a plain cotton dress and kept her eyes on the stitches. Nora knew, even before she understood the words, that her mother carried some shame the others had placed on her and then pretended had always been there. When the women lowered their voices, Nora felt her mother's foot touch her shoe once, just once, as if to say, "Stay still, let it pass." There was no father in Nora's childhood, only a blank space adults stepped around. At school, children repeated what they heard at supper tables. At church picnics, women smiled at Caroline with pity and watched Nora with curiosity. But at night, in their 2-room rented house behind the feed store, Caroline became someone else. She spread scraps of cloth across the kitchen table and turned them into order. "This piece looks useless by itself," she told Nora, holding up a triangle cut from an old dress. "But nothing is useless when it finds where it belongs." That was the first lesson Nora ever trusted. By 12, Nora could thread a needle in lamplight without squinting. By 15, she could mend a torn sleeve so cleanly the rip looked like it had never happened. Her mother taught her how to measure twice, how to hide a knot, and how to read a quilt pattern the way other people read a map. A crooked star meant one thing. A broken ladder meant another. A row of flying geese could point toward a road, a river, or a warning. Caroline never explained everything. Sometimes Nora asked why certain initials were stitched so small they nearly disappeared. Her mother would smooth the cloth with her palm. "Some stories have to wait for the right hands," she said. The object Nora loved most was her mother's thimble, dented silver, worn thin on one side from years of pushing needles through stubborn cloth. Caroline kept it in a tea tin beside a stub of pencil, folded patterns, and tiny scraps. Nora opened the tin just to hear the tiny sound of metal touching metal. To her, it sounded like work. It sounded like survival. When Nora turned 18, she wanted to study textile restoration at a community college 2 counties over. She filled out the form herself and hid it beneath the flour jar until she found the courage to show her mother. Caroline read every line while rain tapped against the window. For one bright moment, pride lifted her face. Then Aunt Viola stepped onto the porch without knocking. She saw the papers. She saw Nora's name. By Sunday, Nora heard the verdict, spoken in pieces too expensive, too proud, too much like her mother, too eager to rise above her place. Caroline said little, but that night she pressed the silver thimble into Nora's palm. "Keep making things straight," she whispered. "Even when people cut them crooked." Nora did not leave that year. Her mother's cough worsened with winter, and money thinned until every bill seemed to arrive with teeth. Nora took sewing work from anyone who would pay. Curtains for the church basement, hems for funeral suits, patches on work pants, quilt repairs for families who praised her stitches, but never invited her through the front door. She learned to keep receipts and envelopes, to write names and dates on every order, and to notice when an old piece of cloth did not match the story people told about it. Those habits made her useful, but not welcome. After Caroline grew too weak to climb the hill to church, the Wren relatives came less often. When they did, they looked around the rented house, as if measuring what could be taken later. Nora would find Aunt Viola's fingers resting on the tea tin, or Uncle Merritt staring too long at the folded quilts in the cedar chest. The first sign that Nora's life was about to collapse came 3 weeks before the funeral, when she found her mother sitting upright in bed at dawn, a scrap of old quilt cloth clutched in her hand. A small blackbird was stitched in one corner, with the initials C.W. hidden beneath its wing. "If they take everything," Caroline whispered. "Go up the north road, past the churchyard, past the burned oak." Nora leaned closer. "There's a hall where women used to sew," her mother said. "I should have told you sooner." Then footsteps sounded on the porch, and Aunt Viola's knock cut through the room like a judge's gavel. Aunt Viola did not wait for anyone to invite her in. She came through the door, with her black coat buttoned to her throat, rain shining on her shoulders, and a paper grocery sack tucked under one arm. Behind her stood Uncle Merritt, tall and silent in the porch light. His eyes moved past Nora and went straight to the cedar chest at the foot of Caroline's bed. Caroline's fingers tightened around the scrap of quilt cloth. Nora stepped between the bed and the doorway. "She's resting. She is family," Viola said. "We have a right to see her." The words sounded proper, almost gentle, but Nora knew the difference between care and inventory. Viola's gaze passed over the medicine bottles, the folded quilts, the tea tin on the table, the stack of unpaid bills beside the lamp. She noticed everything the way some people notice loose coins. Caroline tried to lift herself against the pillows. Her face had grown thin enough that the bones seemed too close to the skin. Still, when Viola came near the bed, Caroline turned the quilt scrap inward, hiding the blackbird against her palm. "What's that?" Viola asked. "Nothing," Caroline said. Viola smiled without warmth. Nothing always did take up a lot of room in this house. Nora felt the old anger rise, but Caroline's eyes found hers and held her quiet. That was how it had always been. Swallow the insult, smooth the cloth, keep the seam from tearing in public. Viola opened the grocery sack and began removing jars, soup, apple butter, a small tin of tea, all arranged on the table with the stiff generosity of someone who wanted witnesses more than gratitude. Uncle Merritt stood near the cedar chest, one boot angled toward it. When Viola finally left, she touched the lid of the chest. "You'll want to let us know before you start sorting things," she said. "Some of Caroline's quilts belong with the Wren family." Nora looked at her mother. Caroline had closed her eyes, but one tear had slipped down beside her nose. After they were gone, Nora locked the door and dragged a kitchen chair under the knob. Then she sat beside the bed until morning, holding her mother's hand while the rain softened into mist outside the window. For the next 3 weeks, the house became smaller around them. The doctor came twice and left with the careful face of a man who had no medicine strong enough for poverty and time. Nora washed sheets in cold water, fed her mother spoonfuls of broth, and sewed by the bedside when Caroline slept. Every stitch was paid work now. Every coin went into a chipped saucer near the stove. Rent was due on the 1st. Burial costs waited like a shadow in the corner. The Wren relatives sent casseroles, but not money. Caroline faded by inches. Some mornings, she woke clear and reached for Nora's hand. Other mornings, she spoke to people who were not in the room. She called out names Nora had heard only in half-stories: Mabel, Ruth Ann, Josephine, women from the old hills who had once sewn together before Nora was born. Once, near midnight, Caroline whispered, "Don't let Viola cut it apart." "What, Mama?" But Caroline only stared toward the dark window, where rain slid down the glass like loose thread. Nora began writing things down. North Road, churchyard, burned oak, hall where women used to sew, blackbird. She wrote the words on the back of an old envelope and tucked it into the tea tin with the silver thimble. The day Caroline died was strangely bright. Sunlight came through the curtains in hard white lines, showing dust in the air and every worn place on the floorboards. Caroline asked Nora to open the cedar chest. Inside were 6 quilts, each folded with lavender and brown paper. Nora lifted them one by one so her mother could see the colors. The last quilt was blue, cream, and brown. The one Caroline had kept, wrapped separately for years. Her mother's hand trembled toward it. "Yours," Caroline breathed. Nora bent close, afraid to miss even one syllable. "Not theirs." Then Caroline's eyes moved to the window, past Nora, past the little house, toward the mountains beyond town. Her lips parted once more, but no sound came. The clock still ticked. A truck passed on the road. Somewhere a dog barked, but Nora felt the world drop away beneath her feet, as if every board in the house had given out at once. By afternoon, Viola had arrived with Merritt and 2 women from the church. They came in black dresses, speaking softly, carrying authority like a second set of keys. Nora was still sitting on the edge of the bed, the blue quilt in her lap, when Viola took it from her. "Not now," Viola said. "You're upset." Nora did not have the strength to fight. Her mother's body was still in the room. The air still held the scent of lavender, medicine, and the last broth Nora had tried to feed her. So she let go, but only because grief had made her hands numb. The funeral happened 2 days later. At Laurel County Funeral Home, Nora stood beside the casket while people told her what a sweet woman Caroline had been. They said it as if sweetness were the same as justice. They patted Nora's arm, called her poor thing, and walked away toward the relatives who had money, land, and the right last name. On the printed program, Caroline was listed as Caroline May Wren, beloved sister and aunt. No one had written beloved mother. Nora read that line until the letters blurred. She looked across the room at Viola, who was accepting condolences with Caroline's blue quilt folded over her arm. That was when Nora understood. Her mother had not only died, she was already being taken. The blue quilt was still folded over Viola's arm when Nora crossed the funeral home carpet. For 1 second, she did not feel like a grown woman. She felt 7 years old again, standing under a quilting frame while the Wren women spoke above her, deciding what could be said and what had to be hidden. "That was hers," Nora said. Viola turned slowly, careful to keep her face arranged for the last few mourners near the coffee urn. "Your mother wanted family things kept properly. I am her family." The room went quiet in the way rooms do when everyone hears the truth but waits to see who has enough power to deny it. Uncle Merritt stepped closer. His black suit hung broad across his shoulders. "This isn't the time. It was in her lap when she died," Nora said. "She told me it was mine." Viola's fingers tightened around the folded cloth. Grief makes people hear what they want. Nora reached out, not grabbing, not shouting, only touching the edge of the quilt where a brown square met a blue one. She could see her mother's stitches there, small and even. The thread pulled with that familiar quiet patience. Viola jerked the quilt away, as if Nora had dirtied it. "That belongs to the family," she said, her voice low enough to sound private and sharp enough to cut. "You don't." No one defended Nora. Not the churchwomen, not the funeral director, not the cousins eating pound cake in the corner. They watched her the way people watch rain slide down a window. Sorry, perhaps, but not enough to step outside and get wet. Nora left the funeral home without the quilt. The sky had turned the color of wet ash. She walked back to the rented house behind the feed store, with her coat unbuttoned and her hands empty. Every porch light she passed seemed to belong to someone else. Every window held a family seated around supper, safe inside names that no one questioned. At home, the kitchen chair was no longer under the doorknob. Nora stopped on the porch. The door stood open 2 inches. Mud showed on the threshold. Inside, the house had already been entered. The cedar chest sat open at the foot of the bed. The 6 quilts were gone. Her mother's good Sunday shoes were gone. The framed photograph from the dresser was gone. Even the little jar of dried lavender Caroline had kept beside the bed had been taken, as if scent itself could be claimed by blood. Nora crossed the room slowly, afraid of what else was missing. She found the tea tin under a stack of folded sheets, pushed far back on the kitchen shelf where Viola had not thought to look. Her fingers shook as she opened it. The silver thimble was still there. So was the envelope. North Road, churchyard, burned oak, hall where women used to sew, Blackbird. Nora pressed the envelope to her chest and breathed for the first time since the funeral home. Then a truck door slammed outside. Her landlord, Mr. Pritchard, stood in the yard with his hat in both hands. He was not a cruel man, which somehow made what he had come to say harder. He looked at the open door, the half-stripped room, the unwashed dishes in the sink, and then at Nora. "I'm sorry," he said. Those two words had been following her all week. "The lease was in your mother's name," he continued. "Viola came by. Said the family would settle the last month. But they won't be responsible after that." "I can pay," Nora said, though they both looked toward the chipped saucer by the stove and knew it was not true. Pritchard rubbed the brim of his hat. "I got a nephew needing a place by Monday. You can have tonight. Maybe tomorrow morning." Nora nodded because there was no shape her anger could take that would build a roof over her head. After he left, she packed what remained into one suitcase. 2 dresses, her sewing scissors, 3 envelopes of receipts, a spool of white thread, her mother's thimble, and the scrap of quilt cloth with the blackbird stitched in the corner. She folded the scrap inside her Bible, not because she was especially holy in that moment, but because even Viola would think twice before digging through scripture in public. At dusk, Nora walked to the county clerk's office. She did not know why, except that grief had left her with only instructions, and her mother's instructions had named a place. The clerk was locking the front door when he saw her. "Office is closed. I need to ask about the old sewing hall up the North Road," Nora said. "Past the churchyard. Past the burned oak." The clerk paused. No one paused over places that meant nothing. "You mean Laurel Ridge Quilt Hall?" he said. The name struck her like a match in a dark room. "It still exists? If you can call it that. Roof's bad. Foundation's worse. Counties had it on the tax list for years." He shifted his key ring from one hand to the other. "No sane person wants it." Nora thought of Viola's hand pulling the quilt away. She thought of her mother whispering, "Not theirs." She thought of a blackbird hidden beneath a stitched wing. "What happens to it?" she asked. "Back tax sale," he said. "Minimum certificate is $11. But I'm telling you, Miss Wren, it's not a home. It's barely a building." Nora opened her purse. $12 lay folded inside, soft from being counted too many times. The clerk watched her place $11 on the counter just inside the door. "Your aunt know you're asking about this." "No," Nora said. He gave her a long look, then unlocked the office again. A single yellow bulb buzzed over the counter as he pulled a folder from a drawer and slid a paper toward her. The property description meant little to Nora, all ridge lines and parcel numbers. But at the bottom was a space for a name, her name. For the first time that day, no one crossed it out. Nora signed slowly, pressing hard enough for the pen to leave a groove in the paper beneath. When she stepped back into the evening, she had $1 left, 1 suitcase waiting at home, and a tax sale certificate for a place everyone else had abandoned. By morning, she would have no house behind the feed store. But she had a road, and for the first time in her life, it led to something that was hers. Morning came without mercy. Nora woke on the kitchen floor because she had been afraid to sleep in her mother's bed. The house was too empty now. Gray light pressed against the window. Somewhere in town, ordinary people were putting coffee on stoves, tying boots, calling children to breakfast. Nora folded her blanket and stood. She moved through the little house slowly, touching nothing she could not carry. The nail where her mother's photograph had hung left a pale square on the wall. The cedar chest stood open like a mouth robbed of its story. The air still smelled faintly of lavender beneath the sharper scent of cold ashes. She packed the last things by hand. The tea tin, the Bible with the blackbird scrap tucked inside, her sewing scissors, a needlebook, the tax sale certificate. and the $1 left in her purse. She put on her mother's old brown coat, though the sleeves were too short. Then she stood at the threshold and looked back. There should have been a prayer for leaving the only home she had ever known. All Nora had was silence. Mr. Pritchard came before 8 with his nephew in the truck beside him. The young man looked away when he saw Nora's suitcase. Pritchard cleared his throat and said he was sorry again. Nora nodded. There seemed to be no end to the number of people who could be sorry while still taking something from her. She carried her suitcase down the porch steps. Rain from the night before had left the yard soft, and her shoes sank into the mud. At the road, she turned once. The rented house behind the feed store was small and plain, but for 27 years it had held her mother's voice. Now it held only other people's plans. Nora walked north. The town did not watch her leave, which was worse than being watched. A few shop windows glowed. The barber swept hair from his doorway. At the bakery, a woman Nora had hemmed dresses for looked straight at her suitcase and then quickly down at the loaves in the window. By the time she passed the last row of houses, the road had narrowed and begun to climb. The pavement broke into old gravel, and the gravel broke into a rutted mountain lane that curved along the ridge. Mist clung to the hollows below. Bare trees lifted black branches against the wet sky. Water ran in thin silver lines along the ditch, carrying leaves and red clay down toward town. Her suitcase grew heavier every quarter mile. She shifted it from one hand to the other, then tied one of her mother's quilting ribbons around the handle where the cracked leather cut into her palm. The ribbon was blue, faded almost gray. Caroline had used it to bundle scraps together, pieces too small for most people to save. Nothing is useless when it finds where it belongs. Nora heard the sentence as clearly as if her mother were walking beside her. The churchyard appeared after the first hard bend. It sat on a rise above the road, fenced in rusted iron, its stones leaning under moss and rain. Nora stopped at the gate. Most of the Wren dead were buried there, their names carved deep into granite. Fathers, mothers, beloved sons, faithful daughters. Generations laid in rows, tidy as stitches on a church quilt. Caroline would be buried there too, but not yet. Nora wondered whether the stone would say mother. She wondered whether anyone would ask her what words belonged above the woman who had given her life. She did not go inside. Instead, Nora stood outside the fence and looked at the blank strip of earth waiting under a canvas tarp. "I'm going," she whispered. It was not goodbye. It was the only promise she could make with no money, no quilt, and no roof waiting ahead. Past the churchyard, the road steepened. The trees closed in. Rhododendron crowded the banks and tangled green walls. Old fence posts appeared and vanished under vines. Once, Nora passed a collapsed spring house, its stone mouth full of ferns. Far below, the town disappeared behind folds of mist, until even the church steeple looked small enough to be tucked inside a sewing basket. Her breath came hard. Her calves burned. Every few minutes, she had to stop and listen to the mountain. No neighbor called from a porch. No mother waited by a stove. Only rain, crows, and the dull thud of her suitcase against her knee. Near noon, the burned oak came into view. It stood at a fork in the road, enormous and blackened, its trunk split by lightning long ago. Half of it was dead, silver limbs reaching toward the clouds. The other half had pushed out small green leaves from a living seam. Nora set her suitcase down and stared at it. Past the churchyard, past the burned oak. Her mother had not imagined it. The road was real. A wooden sign leaned in the weeds beyond the fork. Most of the white paint had peeled away, but beneath moss and grime, Nora could still make out 3 words carved by hand. Laurel Ridge Hall. No one had written Quilt on the sign. Maybe the mountain had swallowed the rest. Maybe someone had scraped it away. Nora followed the narrower track. The lane dipped under arching branches and rose again over a shoulder of land, where the wind came colder. The ground was rough with stones. Briars caught at her skirt. Once she stumbled, caught herself on a fence rail, and felt the silver thimble knock against the tea tin inside her pocket. At last, the trees opened. The hall stood in a clearing of wet grass and wild blackberry, larger than Nora expected and sadder than she was ready for. Its long porch sagged in the middle. One shutter hung crooked beside a broken window. The roof had lost patches of tin, and rainwater dripped steadily into a barrel beneath the eaves. A stone chimney rose at one end, dark with lichen. Over the double doors, barely visible under weather and time, was the faded outline of a painted quilt square. Nora did not move for a long while. The place looked abandoned by everyone, but it had not vanished. She picked up her suitcase, crossed the clearing, and climbed the porch steps one by one. The boards groaned under her weight. At the door, she took out the tax sale certificate and held it in both hands. Behind her, the road back to town was already disappearing into fog. Ahead of her, the old hall waited in silence. Nora put her palm against the door and felt the wood, cold and swollen from years of rain. Then, with no one left to ask permission from, she pushed. The door resisted like a thing that had forgotten how to open. Nora put her shoulder against the swollen wood and pushed again. The latch gave with a cracked sound, and the double doors shuddered inward, dragging a line through the dust. Cold air breathed out of the hall. It smelled of wet timber, mouse nests, old ash, and cloth that had slept too long in the dark. The room beyond the doorway was wide and dim. Tall windows lined both walls. Rain ticked through the torn roof into old pans. Leaves gathered in corners. A fallen branch had broken through one window, and blackberry vines reached inside as if the mountain had already begun to take the building back. Nora lifted her suitcase over the threshold. Her shoes left marks in the gray dust. Along the walls stood long tables, some on their sides, some split down the middle. Chairs were stacked in one corner like broken bones. A cabinet hung open near the hearth, bare except for mouse droppings and one blue button. The quilt hall was worse than the clerk had warned. It was not a home. It was barely shelter. Nora walked to the center of the room and turned slowly. The painted quilt, squares high on the beams, had been blurred by smoke and time. She could see triangles, diamonds, maybe a star, but nothing whole. A wooden quilting frame lay collapsed near the platform, strips of old fabric clinging to one rail. "Mama," Nora whispered, though she did not know if she was calling for help or accusing her mother of sending her here too late. Rain tapped louder over her head. She found the worst leak near the center of the roof, where tin had peeled back and left a jagged opening to the sky. Water fell into a dark stain on the floor. When one board sank under her shoe, she stepped back fast. The hall had rules now. Not every place would hold her weight. She put her suitcase on the driest table and began to work because work was the only language that had never lied to her. First, she tested the floor with the handle of a broken broom. Solid. Soft. Solid. Dangerous. She marked the weak places with fallen chair legs. Then she dragged 2 tables away from the leaking center and shoved them under a portion of roof that still held. The effort left her breathing hard, but the space near the stone hearth was dry. The hearth itself was black with old soot. A rusted stovepipe climbed into the chimney, cracked near the elbow but not fallen. Nora crouched and opened the iron door of the small stove set into the hearth. Ash spilled out, dry beneath the top layer. Dry. The word moved through her like warmth before there was any fire. She searched for anything that would burn. Under the platform, she found broken slats, old newspapers, and a crate of brittle kindling. Someone had stored it there and never returned. Her mother had taught her how to start a fire from almost nothing. Twist paper tight, make a little roof of sticks, leave space for air. Do not smother the first small flame by wanting too much heat too fast. Nora struck a match from the sewing kit she kept wrapped in cloth. The first one broke. The second flared and went out before the paper caught. She closed her eyes, breathed once, and tried again. The third match held. A thin flame licked the newspaper, bent, brightened, and climbed into the kindling. Smoke coughed back into the room. Nora adjusted the stovepipe with a strip of cloth around her hand and waited. For several seconds, the hall filled with bitter smoke. Then the chimney drew. The smoke lifted. The flame steadied. A small orange light trembled behind the iron door. Nora sat back on her heels and began to cry without making a sound. It was not happiness. Not yet. It was the shock of finding one thing willing to work. The stove had not asked whether she belonged. It had not demanded blood. It only required patience, dry wood, and hands that knew how to begin. Outside, the rain turned heavy. Nora moved her suitcase closer and took inventory by firelight. 2 dresses, a comb, sewing scissors, needlebook, receipts, Bible, tea tin, $1, tax sale certificate, a life reduced to what could fit on a table. She opened the tea tin and took out the silver thimble. The firelight found every dent. Nora slipped it over her finger and pressed her thumb against the worn side. "I made it here," she said. The words sounded small, but they stayed. Near the hearth, a narrow door led to a side room. It opened into a former kitchen or workroom with a stone sink, a cracked counter, and shelves crowded with jars full of dust. A pump stood over the sink, its handle rusted but whole. Nora pulled it once. Nothing. Twice. Nothing. On the 4th pull, the pipe groaned deep in the wall. Brown water spat into the sink, then slowed to a trickle. Nora stared. She pumped again and again until the water ran clearer. Not clean enough to trust yet, but real. The hall had water. Not much. Not easy. But enough to boil. The second small hope came from a cupboard beneath the counter. A dented kettle, 2 enamel cups, a cast iron pan, and a folded wool blanket smelling of cedar and mice. Nora shook the blanket outside under the porch roof until dust rose in clouds. It was stained, but not rotten. She hung it near the fire and watched steam lift from the damp wool. By late afternoon, she had chosen her corner. A dry place beside the hearth, 1 table for her suitcase, 1 chair with a slight wobble, a kettle cooling near the stove, the blanket spread over 2 old cushions. It was not comfort, but it was a shape comfort could begin from. As darkness gathered, Nora ate the last biscuit from her coat pocket and drank hot water from the enamel cup. The hall creaked around her. Wind moved under the eaves. Somewhere above the ceiling, a small animal scratched and went still. Fear came with night. It came when the fire burned low and the room beyond the hearth widened into shadow. It came when Nora thought of Viola holding the blue quilt. It came when she understood that no one in town expected her to last 2 days here. Maybe some of them were already waiting for the mountain to scare her back down. Ashamed and empty-handed, Nora fed 1 more slat into the stove. "I am not going back tonight," she said. Then, because saying it once was not enough, she said it again. She unfolded the tax sale certificate and placed it on the table beside the tea tin. The paper looked thin and foolish in that ruined hall, but it bore her name, Nora Wren. Not guest, not mistake, not poor thing. Owner. The word frightened her almost as much as it steadied her. Before lying down, she took the blackbird scrap from her Bible and smoothed it beside the fire. The little stitched bird was dark against the faded cloth. Its wing bent as if hiding something beneath it. Nora traced the stitches with the tip of her finger. She did not know yet why her mother had sent her here. She only knew the hall had given her a dry corner, a fire, and water from an old pipe that should have been dead. For that first night, it was enough. Nora lay under the musty wool blanket and watched firelight move across the broken ceiling. Rain kept falling. The mountain held its breath around the building, and inside the abandoned quilt hall, a woman with no other roof listened to the old boards settle beneath her and let herself believe, for one thin moment, that ruin was not the same thing as ending. The first morning in the quilt hall arrived through holes in the roof. A blade of pale light crossed Nora's face and woke her before the fire had fully died. She did not know where she was. The ceiling above her was not the stained plaster of the rented house. It was dark rafters, broken tin, and strips of gray sky showing through like torn cloth. Then she heard water dripping into pans and remembered. The hall, her mother gone, her name on a paper that did not feel strong enough to protect her from anything. Nora sat up under the mouse-scented blanket and listened. No wagon on the road, no ant at the door, only rainwater, wind, and the old building settling around her. She boiled water, wrapped her hands around the enamel cup, and made herself study the hall the way her mother had taught her to study torn fabric, not as damage, but as information. The largest leak came from the middle roof seam. The weakest boards ran between the front doors and the platform. The west windows were cracked, but not gone. The hearth corner could be made livable. The kitchen pump needed priming, but still answered. She took her pencil from the tea tin and wrote on an old receipt. Roof, floor, pump, windows, hearth, door latch. A person could drown in sorrow if she did not give her hands something honest to do. By mid-morning, Nora had dragged branches from the threshold, swept a path to the kitchen, and tied cloth around the broken latch so the front doors would stay shut. In the workroom, she found rusted nails and a hammer with a split handle. Both felt like treasure. Not enough to fix the hall. Enough to begin. While searching for boards to cover the worst floor gaps, she climbed the low platform at the far end of the room. It had once been the hall's proudest part. Nora could tell by the way the windows faced it, by the half-circle of chairs before it, by the faded curtains hanging like tired witnesses. A massive floor loom stood behind the left curtain. Nora stopped. Until then, she had thought the collapsed frame near the hearth was all that remained of the hall's old tools. But this loom had survived in shadow. It was taller than Nora, wide across the shoulders like a sleeping animal, its beams dark with age, its treadles buried under dust. One side leaned slightly, but the main frame was whole. She wiped her fingers across the top rail. Beneath the grime, someone had carved small marks into the wood. At first, she thought they were scratches from use. Then she saw the shape. A blackbird, its wing bent inward. Nora took the quilt scrap from her pocket and held it beside the carving. The stitched bird on the cloth and the carved bird on the loom were not identical, but they were too close to be accident. Same curved beak, same tucked wing, same hidden place beneath the feathers where her mother had stitched the initials C.W. The hall seemed to grow quieter. Nora touched the carving. The groove had been worn smooth by time and maybe by hands. She searched the rest of the loom. There were other marks, faint and almost swallowed by dust. 3 tiny triangles near the lower beam, a crooked ladder on the side rail, and a row of geese pointing toward the floor. Nora recognized the shapes, but they were not arranged like decoration. They were too deliberate, too low, too hidden. Her mother's voice came back to her. A row of flying geese can point toward a road, a river, or a warning. Nora crouched. The geese had been carved along the inside of the lower beam, where no one standing in the room would see them. Their points angled down, not across. Down toward the floor beneath the loom. She moved a pile of fallen cloth strips away with the broom handle. Under them lay a woven rug, stiff with dust, its colors faded into brown and gray. It should have crumbled when she lifted one corner. But the underside had been lined with old canvas. A pattern was stitched along the edge. Blackbird, ladder, 3 triangles, geese. Nora pulled the rug aside. The floorboards beneath it were cleaner than the boards around them, as if they had been protected from years of dust. They were also narrower, fitted in a rectangle beneath the loom. Nora tapped one board with the hammer handle. Solid. She tapped another. The sound changed. A hollow note answered from below. Nora froze. For a long moment, she heard only her own breath and rain ticking into a pan behind her. Then she tapped again, softer this time. Hollow. Definite. Not rot. Not the dangerous sag of water-damaged wood. This was space. Someone had built a space beneath the loom. She looked toward the front doors as if Viola might appear there, drawn up the mountain by the sound. No one came. The hall remained still, but the stillness felt different now. Less empty, more watchful. Nora searched for a ring pull, a latch, anything that might lift the boards. But there was only dust, old nail heads, and a seam so fine it nearly disappeared. Whoever had made it had known how to hide work inside work. She knew stitches, she knew repairs, she knew the difference between a careless patch and a secret seam. This was no accident left by carpenters. This was a hiding place made by someone patient, someone like her mother. Or someone her mother had known. The room had gone cold around her knees. Nora stood too quickly, and the hammer slipped from her hand, striking the boards with a dull knock that echoed under the loom. From beneath the floor came a faint settling sound, not enough to tell her what waited there, only enough to tell her something did. Nora did not open the floor that day. She told herself it was because she needed better tools, more light, and a steadier hand. All of that was true. But beneath the truth was fear. If the space below the loom held nothing, then her mother's final directions might be only grief talking. And if it held something, Nora was not sure she was ready for the weight of it. So she covered the boards again before nightfall, pulled the rug back into place, and sat beside the stove with the blackbird scrap in her lap. She did not yet know that the hollow beneath the loom was tied to every insult Viola had ever spoken, and every missing word on Caroline's funeral program. She only knew her mother had sent her to a building everyone called worthless, and somewhere under its oldest loom, the building had answered. Nora waited until the second clear morning to open the floor. The rain had finally moved east, leaving the mountain washed and shining under a thin sun. Light poured through the cracked windows of the quilt hall and lay in pale squares across the boards. The stove still held enough heat from breakfast to warm the hearth corner. Outside, water dripped from the eaves into the barrel with slow, patient notes. She had spent the day before gathering what she needed. A rusted pry bar from the kitchen cupboard, the hammer with the split handle, a lantern she had cleaned with a scrap of dress lining, 2 candles, her sewing scissors, because she did not know what kind of wrapping she might find. The tax sale certificate lay on the table near the tea tin, as if paper could stand guard over paper. For nearly an hour, Nora only knelt beside the loom and looked. The rug was rolled back. The rectangle of narrow boards waited beneath it, cleaner than the floor around them. In daylight, she saw details she had missed before. 4 nail heads that did not match the others, a hairline seam along the edge, and 1 small carved mark near the lowest treadle. A blackbird with its wing folded tight. Nora slipped her mother's silver thimble over her finger. She did not need it for the work ahead, but she needed the feel of it. She needed one piece of Caroline with her that Viola had not stolen. "Tell me true," she whispered. Then, she set the pry bar into the seam and pressed. At first, nothing moved. She shifted her weight, pressed again, and heard a small dry crack, not of breaking wood but of something old letting go. Dust lifted. The board rose a 1/4 inch. Nora worked the bar along the seam, careful not to splinter the piece. Whoever had made this hiding place had done it with the patience of a cabinet maker. Whoever opened it owed that patience back. 1 board came free, then another. Cold air breathed up from below. Nora lowered the lantern. Beneath the floor was not a cellar, only a narrow hollow, framed between old beams. Inside lay a cedar box wrapped in oilcloth, wedged so tightly between the supports that it must have been placed there before the final boards were fitted. Around it were smaller bundles, cloth-wrapped and tied with string gone brown with age. Her hands trembled, not because she expected treasure, because the hollow did not feel abandoned. It felt kept. She lifted the smallest bundle first. The cloth cracked softly as she untied it. Inside were sewing needles wrapped in paper, a folded measuring tape, and a pair of steel scissors dark with age but still sharp at the tips. On the paper was written in a careful hand, "For the next woman who needs to mend what others tore." Nora sat back on her heels. The words entered her slowly, then settled somewhere deeper than grief. She opened the second bundle. It held coins. Not many, mostly old quarters, $half, and a few worn silver pieces. Beneath them lay a note. "Hall tax money. Do not spend unless keeping the roof above women." There was no fortune, no miracle, no sudden rescue shining in a box, but there was enough to understand that someone had planned for survival, not riches. Someone had believed the hall might one day need saving again. Nora turned to the cedar box. The lid had swollen against its hinges. She used the pry bar gently, then her scissors to cut the oilcloth seam. The smell rose first: cedar, paper, dried lavender, and the faint iron scent of ink that had survived decades. Inside was a book. It was larger than a Bible, bound in dark cloth, worn smooth at the corners. Across the front, stitched rather than written, were 3 words: Laurel Ridge Patterns. Nora opened it with both hands. The first pages were ordinary enough to fool anyone in a hurry. Quilt blocks drawn in pencil, measurements, fabric notes, Names of colors: blackbird, broken ladder, widow's window, flying geese, hearth star, mountain road. Then she turned a page and found columns beside the patterns. Family name, parcel, date paid, witness, pattern delivered. Her breath stopped. She leaned closer. The names were not Wren names. They were names she knew from town, but had never seen in the Wren family Bible. Boone, Pike, Hensley, Carver, Bell, Rusk, Freeman. Women's names appeared beside men's. Widows, daughters, sisters, sometimes only initials, sometimes a note, husband away, husband dead, deed held by cousin, bank refusing receipt, clerk changed boundary. Nora turned another page. A small map was drawn inside a quilt block. At first it looked like pattern geometry, triangles, strips, a crooked path of dark squares. But her mother had taught her too well. A row of geese could point toward a road. A broken ladder could mark a boundary. A star could show a house. The pattern was not only a pattern, it was land. It was a way to hide a map where men who ignored women's sewing would never think to look. Nora found loose papers tucked between the pages. Tax receipts, copies of deeds, letters written in women's hands. One letter began, "Caroline, if they come asking for the Holland Ridge, tell Ruth Ann the fence line is not where Merritt says it is." Nora's skin went cold at the name. Merritt, not her uncle, perhaps. Maybe an older Merritt. A father, grandfather, another man in the same family line. But the handwriting beside the letter was unmistakably her mother's. Pattern changed to blackbird. Safe copy under Loom. Safe copy. Nora turned pages faster now, then forced herself to slow down before she tore something that had survived too much already. Every few pages, a blackbird appeared in the margin. Sometimes its wing was closed, sometimes open. Sometimes there were initials beneath it. CV. Caroline Wren. Her mother had not only known about the hall, she had used it. Nora found the first letter addressed to her 20 minutes later. It was tucked near the back of the book, wrapped in a scrap of blue cloth from the very quilt Viola had taken. On the outside, in Caroline's hand, was written, "For Nora, if they leave her with nothing but the truth." Nora's vision blurred so suddenly she had to set the letter down. She wiped her eyes with her sleeve, angry at the tears because they made the ink swim. Then she unfolded the paper carefully. "My girl, if you are reading this, then I waited too long or ran out of strength before I could say it plain. I am sorry for both. They told you I brought shame into the family. They told you silence was safer. They told you some names are best left out of records, programs, and prayers. But your name was never the shame. Mine was not either. This hall belonged to women before the Wrens decided history should belong to whoever held the courthouse keys." Nora pressed the heel of her hand to her mouth. The letter continued. "When I was young, I learned what the old patterns meant. They were not just quilts. They were warnings, maps, receipts, promises. Women used them when banks would not listen, when clerks changed lines, when husbands died, and cousins came with papers already prepared. A quilt could hang over a porch and tell another woman where the true deed was hidden, who had paid tax, which road was safe, which man should not be trusted. I kept the book because I thought one day I would be brave enough to use it in the open. I was not brave soon enough. But you are better at keeping records than I ever was. You notice what others miss. You always did." Nora lowered the letter and looked around the ruined hall. The collapsed tables, the faded beams, the loom standing in dust like an old witness. All her life, she had thought her mother's quiet was surrender. Now she saw it had been storage. Caroline had been carrying names, maps, receipts, and danger under her ribs while sewing hems for women who looked past her in church. Nora read the last lines. "If Viola or Merritt has taken the blue quilt, do not chase the cloth first. Look beneath the loom. The quilt is the key, but the book is the door. The blackbird pattern is ours. Not because they gave it to us, because women before us trusted us to carry it. You are my daughter. You are Caroline Wren's child. Let no printed program, no courthouse clerk, and no blood-proud woman tell you different." Under the letter was one more folded sheet. A list of names, Not just landowners, witnesses, women still living, or children of women who had once come to the hall. Miss Etta Boone's name was near the top, followed by an address on Laurel Creek Road and a note in Caroline's handwriting. Etta can read what I could not finish. Nora sat in the center of the hall with the open box before her and understood, slowly, what had been given to her. The material value was not gold. It was better than gold for people who had nearly lost everything. Receipts, copies, maps, proof. Enough to reopen questions buried in courthouse dust. Enough to make certain families nervous. The emotional value was heavier still. Her mother had not been merely tolerated by history. She had been part of a hidden line of women who protected each other when official doors stayed closed. And the action value was clear enough to frighten her. This was not a keepsake. This was a responsibility. Nora gathered the papers into careful stacks. Pattern book, Caroline's letter, tax receipts, deed copies, witness list, quilt code notes. She wrote each category on scraps of paper and placed them between the bundles. Her hands became steady as she worked. Grief still sat inside her, but it no longer filled every room. For the first time since the funeral, Nora felt something besides loss. She felt direction. Near sunset, she returned the empty cedar box to the hollow, but kept the book and letters with her by the hearth. The hall had changed without moving. The walls were still cracked. The roof still leaked. The floor still sagged in dangerous places. But now, every faded quilt square above the beams seemed less like decoration and more like a sentence waiting to be read. Nora opened Caroline's letter once more and traced the final line. You are my daughter. Outside, wind moved through the blackberry vines. Inside, beside a small fire in the abandoned quilt hall, Nora Wren placed her mother's silver thimble on top of the pattern book and understood why Viola had reached for the quilt, as if it were silver. It was not the cloth she feared losing. It was the story stitched inside it. Nora did not take the pattern book down the mountain the next morning. She almost did. She packed it once in the bottom of her suitcase, wrapped in the wool blanket, with Caroline's letter folded inside the front cover. Then she stood over the suitcase and imagined slipping on the wet road. Imagined a stranger's hand reaching into it. Imagined Viola's fingers closing over the book the way they had closed over the blue quilt. So Nora unpacked it. She wrapped the pattern book in oilcloth again, placed it inside the cleanest flour sack she could find, and hid it beneath a loose stone at the back of the hearth. Not the original hiding place, never the first hiding place. Her mother had taught her that without saying it, when people know where you have been, do not leave your heart there for them to find. She kept three things in her coat pocket: Caroline's letter, the witness list, and a copy of one tax receipt bearing the Boone name. If you're still here, subscribe for more stories about women the world tried to erase because Nora was no longer only trying to survive. She was carrying proof powerful people wanted buried. The first danger came softly. It came as a man on horseback, appearing at the edge of the clearing before noon, his hat pulled low, his coat too fine for mountain mud. Nora saw him through the cracked west window while she was scrubbing mouse stains from the kitchen shelf. He did not call out. He only sat there, looking at the hall. After a minute, he turned his horse and rode back down the lane. Nora knew the shape of his shoulders. Uncle Merritt. By evening, smoke rose from two chimneys below, but no lamp came up the mountain. Nora bolted the double doors with a length of broken chair leg and slept with the hammer under her blanket. The next morning, the county clerk arrived in a truck that looked afraid of the road. He stood in the wet grass, hat in his hands, glancing at the sagging roof, as if hoping the building would give him a reason to leave. "Miss Wren," he called. "I need to speak with you." Nora stepped onto the porch but did not come down. 3 steps were not much, but they were the first advantage the hall had given her. "What about?" He cleared his throat. "There may have been some confusion with the tax certificate. There was no confusion when I paid." "No, ma'am. The payment is recorded. It's just that certain parties are saying the property may have historical family attachment." "Whose family?" The clerk looked down. "The Wren family has asked for review." There it was. Not grief. Not concern. Review. Nora felt Caroline's letter against her ribs inside her coat. The Wren family had years to pay. I understand that. Did they? The clerk did not answer. Instead, he pulled an envelope from inside his jacket and held it out. Inside was a typed notice, asking her to appear at the county office within 10 days to confirm claim and property condition. The wording was polite. The threat wore clean shoes. If the building is deemed unsafe, the clerk said, the county can condemn it. Now they care whether it falls down? His face reddened. I'm just delivering the notice. No, Nora said. You're delivering a warning someone else wrote. After he left, Nora read the notice 3 times. Certain parties, historical attachment, unsafe structure, review of tax transfer. Words could be stitched crooked, too. By afternoon, the soft danger had become practical. A man from town came to inspect the roof without being asked. He said he was a builder, though his boots had no sawdust on them and his hands were smooth. He walked around the hall making marks on a pad and shaking his head for Nora to see. Place is a death trap, he said. County would be doing you a kindness taking it off your hands. Did the county send you? He smiled. Folks worry about a young woman alone up here. Which folks? The smile thinned. You got a suspicious nature. I got an empty house after a funeral, Nora said. It taught me fast. He left without finishing his circuit. That evening, Nora found boot prints near the kitchen wall, pressed deep in the mud below the small window. Someone had stood there long enough to listen. She did not light the lantern after dark. She sat by a low fire with the pattern book under the hearthstone and Caroline's letter in her lap. Fear moved around the room, but it no longer owned every corner. She had something to protect now. On the 3rd day, Viola came. She arrived in Merritt's truck, wearing her black funeral coat and a face arranged into sorrow. Merritt drove but stayed near the hood. Arms crossed, Viola carried a basket covered with a white cloth, the kind churchwomen used when they wanted charity to look like command. Nora, she called from the yard. This has gone far enough. Nora stood in the doorway. What has? This performance. Viola looked past her into the hall. Sleeping in ruins, making people talk. Your mother would be ashamed. At that, Nora felt something inside her go quiet. My mother sent me here. Viola's eyes flickered. Only once, but Nora saw it. Caroline was ill, Viola said. She said many things near the end. She said enough. Merritt pushed away from the truck. You need to come down and let the county handle this property before you get yourself hurt. I own the tax certificate. Temporary paper, Merritt said. Subject to review. Viola climbed the first porch step. Nora did not move. We are willing to help you, Viola said. You're alone. You're grieving. You have always been impressionable where your mother was concerned. What do you want? The question cut through the performance. For the first time, Viola's face hardened openly. There were items removed from Caroline's house that belonged to the family, she said. You already took them. Not all. Nora's hand closed around the edge of the door. Viola lowered her voice. If Caroline left any papers, patterns, or private writings, they need to be returned before they embarrass people who have done nothing but try to help her. There it was, plain as blood on white cloth. Not concern for Nora. Not fear of the roof. Fear of paper. Nora thought of the pattern book beneath the hearth. She thought of all the women's names written, where no funeral program could erase them. I don't have anything that belongs to you, Nora said. Viola stepped closer. You have no idea what belongs to whom. Nora met her eyes. That has been the trouble all along. For a moment, no one moved. Rainwater dripped from the porch roof between them. Merritt looked toward the broken windows as if measuring where a man might enter after dark. Then Viola smiled again, and the smile frightened Nora more than the anger. Very well, she said. Keep playing house in a dead building. But when the county condemns it, don't come crying to us. Merritt lingered as Viola walked back to the truck. You think a few stitches make you a wren? He said. Nora's voice came out steadier than she felt. No, my mother did. The truck left deep tracks in the clearing. That night, Nora moved the pattern book from under the stone and carried it into the workroom. Behind the cracked sink, she found a loose panel and made a second hiding place. She divided the papers. Book in one place. Letters in another. Receipts wrapped beneath a floor brick. Witness list sewn into the hem of her spare dress. Her sewing had always been called small work. Now it became defense. Before dawn, Nora lit a candle and wrote a name at the top of a clean receipt. Miss Etta Boone. Beside it, she copied the address from Caroline's list. If Viola knew enough to fear the pattern book, then Nora could not wait behind locked doors for the next warning. She needed someone who could read what the old women had written in cloth, someone whose name had been protected by Caroline's hand. When the first bird called, Nora put on her coat, touched the hidden seam where the witness list rested against her dress, and opened the hall door. The road down the mountain looked colder than before, but this time, Nora was not walking away from loss. She was walking toward the first living witness. Nora found Miss Etta Boone's house by following Laurel Creek until the road narrowed to 2 tire tracks and a line of laundry appeared between apple trees. The house was small, whitewashed, and weathered now to the color of bone. Quilts hung over the porch rail, not for decoration, but for air. Nora stopped at the gate when she saw them. A star pattern, a broken ladder, flying geese stitched in dark brown triangles that pointed toward the creek. Her hand went to the hidden seam in her dress. Before she could knock, the door opened. An old woman stood there with a cane in one hand and a dish towel over her shoulder. She was small, sharp-eyed, and so straight in the back that age seemed to have bent around her without winning. "You're Caroline's girl," the woman said. Nora swallowed. "Yes, ma'am." Miss Etta Boone looked at her for a long moment. Then her eyes dropped to Nora's hem, exactly where the witness list had been sewn inside. "You came carrying something you were afraid to lose." Nora nearly stepped back. Etta's mouth softened, but she did not smile. "Good. Fear makes sloppy hands careful." Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke, starch, and dried apples. Quilts covered nearly every chair. Not fancy quilts, working quilts. Quilts with mends, scorch marks, old blood dots from pricked fingers, and patches that did not match, until Nora looked twice and saw the rhythm beneath them. Etta poured coffee into 2 thick mugs. Nora took Caroline's letter from her coat first. Then the tax receipt with Boone written across the top. Last, with her heart beating hard, she unpicked 3 tiny stitches from her dress hem and drew out the folded witness list. Etta did not touch the papers at once. She only looked at Caroline's handwriting, and her face changed in a way Nora had seen at the funeral, but believed more here. Real grief did not perform. It entered quietly and sat down. "She kept it," Etta whispered. "What is it?" Nora asked. "I found a book. Patterns, names, parcel numbers. I can read some of it, but not all." Etta closed her eyes. Laurel Ridge was never just a sewing hall. That was what men called it, because it made them comfortable. What was it? A place women came when the courthouse had no chair for them. The words settled into the room. Etta turned the Boone receipt toward herself. Her finger followed the faded ink. "This was my mother's land. 8 acres above the creek. My father died owing money to the mill store, and my uncle tried to say the debt gave him the field. Caroline was 17 then. She and 3 other women copied the receipt before the clerk could lose it. She helped save your land? She helped save our roof." Etta looked up. "There is a difference, and there is not." Nora listened as Etta began naming the old patterns. Blackbird meant a copy existed. Broken ladder meant a false claim. Widow's window meant a woman alone was in danger of losing property. Flying geese did not always point north. Sometimes they pointed toward the person holding the true paper. Hearth Star meant a document was hidden inside a home, not in the courthouse. Mountain Road meant a witness had to be reached before a man with money reached them first. Nora wrote each word carefully in her receipt book, her hand steadied as it moved. This was something she could do. Listen, record, compare one mark to another. Make a torn story line up again. "Why didn't my mother use this openly?" she asked. Etta's face tightened. "Because the Wrens learned faster than we thought. They did not need to understand every pattern. They only needed to know women were using cloth to remember what papers were trying to erase. Merritt? His father first, then him." Etta tapped the receipt. "Men like that inherit more than land. They inherit habits." Nora told her about Viola taking the quilt, the county notice, the builder with clean hands, and Merritt at the edge of the clearing. Etta's eyes went hard. "They are not waiting for law," she said. "They are waiting for you to make one mistake. What do I do?" "First, stop carrying proof alone." Nora looked at the witness list. "Will they talk to me? Some will be afraid. Some will be ashamed they waited so long. Some will pretend not to remember." Etta reached for her cane. "So we begin with the ones who owe Caroline truth." That afternoon, Etta put on a brown coat and walked with Nora to 3 houses along Laurel Creek. At the Pike place, a widower named Amos brought out a biscuit tin filled with papers his mother had wrapped in flour sacks. He cried when he saw the blackbird mark on Nora's scrap. At the Hensley cabin, 2 sisters first said they knew nothing. Then one opened a sewing basket and showed a quilt block with the same broken ladder stitched so dark it nearly vanished. At the Carver farm, a woman with swollen hands remembered Caroline arriving at night with a lantern and saying, "Do not sign anything until morning." By dusk, Nora had names, dates, and 3 new copies of old receipts. More than that, she had something she had never felt at any Wren table. People making room for her. No one called her poor thing. No one asked whether she had the right blood. They asked what Caroline had saved, what Nora had found, and what still needed protection. When Nora and Etta returned to the little white house, Etta packed a satchel with carbon paper, pencils, a magnifying glass, and a jar of blackberry preserves. "You'll need these," she said. Nora looked toward the mountain, where the quilt hall waited in the darkening ridge. "You don't have to come up there." "No," Etta said. "I do not have to." She took her cane and stepped off the porch anyway. They reached the hall after dark. Nora unlocked the double doors, then uncovered the pattern book from its hiding place behind the sink panel. Etta stood before the old loom for a long time without speaking. Finally, she touched the carved blackbird on the beam. "Hello, Caroline," she said softly. Nora lit the lantern and opened the book on the table. For the first time, the hall did not feel empty. It held the old woman's breathing, the scratch of Nora's pencil, the smell of preserves warming near the stove, and the quiet return of names that had waited years to be spoken aloud. Etta did not save Nora. She gave Nora the tools to save the truth herself. The county hearing was held in the same building where Nora had signed her name on the tax certificate. Only this time, the yellow bulb over the counter was not the only light in the room. The back chamber had been opened, folding chairs arranged in rows, and nearly every seat filled before Nora arrived. Word had moved down the mountain faster than rainwater. A Wren dispute. A condemned hall. Papers found where nobody expected papers to be. Nora entered with Miss Etta Boone beside her and a satchel in her own hands. The room turned. Viola sat in the front row wearing the blue quilt across her lap like a banner of ownership. Merritt stood near the wall with 2 men Nora recognized from the clearing, the builder with clean hands, and another man from the county road office. At the long table sat 3 commissioners, the clerk, and a gray-haired attorney whose polished shoes looked wrong on the scuffed floor. Nora did not look first at Viola. She looked at the quilt. Her mother's final stitches rested under another woman's hands. "Miss Wren," the head commissioner said, "this meeting concerns Laurel Ridge Hall, certificate of back tax transfer, and possible condemnation." Possible. Nora had learned to mistrust soft words placed before hard intentions. The attorney stood. "My clients, members of the Wren family, contend that the certificate was issued in haste, that the property holds family historical significance, and that Miss Nora Wren may not be the appropriate party to assume claim." There it was again. Appropriate. Viola lowered her eyes as if wounded by the burden of righteousness. The attorney continued, "Furthermore, the structure is unsafe. We submit that the county should void the transfer, condemn the property, and allow the family to preserve any meaningful artifacts before demolition." Merritt's gaze rested on Nora's satchel. He did not care about safety. He cared about what she had carried into the room. The commissioner looked at Nora. "Do you wish to respond?" Nora stood. Her hands wanted to tremble, so she placed them flat on the table. Her mother's thimble was in her pocket. The witness list was sewn into her hem. Copies of the papers lay in 3 different homes along Laurel Creek. The originals were not all in this room. and that knowledge steadied her. "I paid the back tax listed by this county," she said. "My name was accepted. The property was unwanted until my aunt learned I had gone there." Viola's face tightened. The attorney smiled. "Miss Wren, no one doubts your feelings. But feelings do not establish competence, ownership, or historical interpretation." A few people shifted in their chairs. Nora opened the satchel and removed the first folder. "No, papers do." She laid the tax certificate on the table. Then the county's own notice. Then copies of receipts from the pattern book, each labeled in her careful hand. Boone, Pike, Hensley, Carver. The attorney glanced at them and gave a small laugh. "Quilt notes? Land notes," Nora said. "Are we now deciding property claims by sewing circles?" Heat rose in Nora's neck, but she kept her voice level. "You can question my education. You cannot change the facts." The room quieted. She opened the pattern book to a copied page she had made the night before, leaving the original safe at the hall. Laurel Ridge Hall was used by women to preserve land receipts and witness copies when courthouse records were changed, lost, or withheld. The patterns mark what kind of document existed and where copies were kept. Merritt pushed away from the wall. "This is nonsense." Miss Etta struck her cane once against the floor. "Not loud. Enough. It is not nonsense," she said. "My mother's land is in that book." The commissioner leaned forward. "Mrs. Boone, do you have direct knowledge?" "I have 81 years of direct knowledge," Etta said. "And I have the receipt my mother kept because Caroline Wren copied it before a clerk could misplace it." Viola's mouth hardened at Caroline's name. Amos Pike stood next. Then the Hensley sisters. Then Mrs. Carver, her swollen hands gripping a biscuit tin. One by one, they carried their old papers forward. Flour sack receipts, folded deeds, letters with blackbird marks in the margins. Nora did not speak for them. She had gathered them, copied them, arranged them, but their voices belonged to them. That was what the Wren family had never understood. A story did not become weaker when more people carried it. It became harder to bury. The attorney tried to regain control. "Even if these sentimental items are genuine, they do not address the condemnation issue." Nora slid another sheet across the table. "I asked Mr. Calder, the carpenter from Laurel Creek, to inspect the hall yesterday. He signed this statement. The roof needs repair, the porch needs bracing, but the main beams are sound. The man who came before never entered the crawl space, never checked the supports, and never gave me a written report." The builder, with clean hands, looked toward the door. The commissioner frowned. "Who authorized your inspection?" Merritt did not answer. Nora turned at last to Viola. "You took my mother's quilt at the funeral," she said. "You said it belonged to the family. If that is true, then you will not mind showing this room the blackbird block." Viola clutched the quilt. "This is indecent." "No," Nora said. Taking it from her daughter beside her casket was indecent. Asking to see the truth stitched inside, it is not. The silence became heavy enough to hear the rain against the windows. The head commissioner nodded. "Mrs. Wren, unfold the quilt." Viola did not move. Merritt stepped forward. "This meeting has gone far enough." "It has not gone nearly far enough," Etta said. Slowly, with every eye on her, Viola unfolded the blue quilt across the front table. The room seemed to hold its breath as the cloth opened. Blue, cream, brown, her mother's stitches small and patient. Nora saw it then, the blackbird block in the lower corner, its wing folded tight. She touched the block gently and turned the edge back. Hidden beneath the wing, in thread almost the same color as the cloth, were initials. TZVRTT. Beside them, smaller still, was a date and one word. Loom. A murmur moved through the room. The attorney said nothing. Nora looked at the commissioners, not at Viola. "My mother did not leave me money. She left me a direction. I followed it. I found records that belong to more families than mine. If you condemn that hall before these records are reviewed, you are not protecting history. You are destroying evidence." For the first time, the head commissioner did not look bored or burdened. He looked afraid of being remembered incorrectly. The board recessed for 20 minutes. No one offered Nora a chair, but Mrs. Carver touched her elbow and guided her to one. Amos Pike stood behind her. Miss Etta remained at her side. Across the room, Viola stared at the quilt, as if it had betrayed her. When the commissioners returned, the decision was short. The condemnation order would be suspended. The tax certificate would stand pending formal review. The hall would be protected from demolition. The clerk was instructed to copy all relevant materials and open a review of altered land records connected to the Wren family filings. Merritt left before the final sentence was finished. Viola stayed. As people rose from their chairs, Nora walked to the table and folded the blue quilt. This time, no one stopped her. Viola's hand reached for the cloth once, then fell. Nora held the quilt against her chest. "It belongs with my mother's work," she said, "and so do I." Then she turned toward the door, carrying the quilt, the satchel, and the first public piece of her mother's name back into the rain. The review took 6 weeks. In those 6 weeks, Nora learned that victory did not arrive like thunder. It arrived in copies, signatures, sworn statements, and old people sitting at kitchen tables, remembering what they had been told to forget. The county clerk copied every page Nora brought him. Miss Etta sat beside her during the first 2 days, correcting names when the old handwriting confused younger eyes. The Pike receipt matched a boundary line that had been moved without notice. The Hensley papers showed taxes paid on land later listed as abandoned. Mrs. Carver's letter proved Caroline had witnessed a deed before the official record disappeared. 1 document became 3. 3 became 12. By the end of the review, the Wren filings no longer looked like family mistakes. They looked like a pattern. Merritt hired another attorney. Viola stopped attending public meetings. The builder with clean hands gave a statement saying he had been asked only to find enough wrong with the hall. The road office man admitted no formal condemnation request had existed until after Nora bought the tax certificate. No one was dragged away in chains. Life was not that simple, and justice in a small county rarely moved fast enough to satisfy grief. But the board suspended several disputed transfers, opened a formal land record investigation, and placed Laurel Ridge Hall under temporary historical protection. The headline in the county paper was small, but Nora cut it out anyway. Women's quilt records prompt land review. Below that, in the 3rd paragraph, was the sentence she read until she nearly knew it by heart. The late Caroline Wren is believed to have preserved key documents connected to multiple family land claims. Late Caroline Wren, not beloved sister, not a mistake folded into the edge of someone else's family. Caroline Wren. Nora carried the paper back to the hall and pinned it to the wall beside the old loom. The first money to repair the roof did not come from treasure. It came from the hall tax coins, donations from families whose names had been preserved, and 3 envelopes left anonymously under the door. Mr. Calder braced the porch and refused full payment. Amos Pike brought boards. The Hensley sisters scrubbed windows. Mrs. Carver brought soup in a lidded pot and told Nora her mother had once saved their upper pasture. One Saturday, the blue quilt was hung over the porch rail in clean mountain sun. Nora stood beneath it with Caroline's silver thimble on her finger and watched women climb the road carrying baskets, papers, scraps, stories. The hall had not made her rich. It had made her undeniable. By autumn, Laurel Ridge Hall no longer looked abandoned. It still bore its scars. Nora did not paint over every dark beam or hide every patched board. Some things deserved to show they had survived. The porch stood straight now. The roof held against rain. The windows had been cleaned until morning light could cross the floor and touch the old loom. Every Thursday, women came up the road. Some brought torn quilts. Some brought letters they had never known how to read. Some brought daughters who were too young to understand deeds and grief, but old enough to learn that a name was something worth protecting. Nora kept the pattern book in a locked cabinet beside the hearth. Not hidden now. Guarded. On the wall above, it hung Caroline's blue quilt. Beneath the folded blackbird wing, Nora had added one small line of stitching in thread the color of mountain dusk. Caroline May Wren. Mother. Keeper of names. The first time she read it aloud, her voice broke. Miss Etta reached over and touched the silver thimble on Nora's finger, but said nothing. Some blessings did not need words. In winter, snow settled over the ridge and softened the road to silence. Nora stayed late one evening after everyone had gone. banking the fire, stacking chairs, folding scraps into baskets the way her mother used to do. Outside, the mountains were blue in the fading light. She stood before the loom and rested her hand on the carved blackbird. For most of her life, Nora had believed belonging was something another person had to hand her. Now, she understood. Sometimes, belonging was a room you repaired with your own hands. Sometimes it was a truth you refused to surrender. Sometimes it was a mother's name, stitched back into the world one careful letter at a time. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to remember that a broken beginning does not mean a broken life. Nora turned down the lamp, closed the hall door, and left one window glowing for anyone still climbing the road.